as horror fans, we like to spend our time exploring the extremes of human experience. There are a lot of ways to do this, and some of them are more disturbing than others. But this video is about 5 of the most disturbing books I've ever read. So that's today's question. What book or books have you found the most disturbing? Think about it for a minute and leave your answer in the comments. I'm interested to hear what you have to say. Let me begin with a word on what I mean by disturbing. I don't necessarily mean scary. In fact, although I'd argue that all of these books are horror, at least one of them might more often be found in a different section in the bookstore. What I mean by disturbing is that they get under your skin. They don't just scare you and creep you out, but they actually make you feel really uncomfortable. That's not the experience everyone wants, of course, so these books aren't necessarily for everyone. But I'd argue that they're important because they reveal some of the ugliest parts of humanity to us. It might not be pleasant to explore that territory, but I think it's necessary to grapple with the parts of ourselves and our fellow human beings that we don't necessarily want to think about. Let me also say that I'm not arguing that these are the 5 most disturbing books ever. I am arguing that they're 5 of the most disturbing books ever. There are certainly others, and in fact I'm already thinking about some others that I didn't choose for this list, but that I'd like to talk about in a future video. Click the subscription button to make sure you don't miss it. Okay, with all of that out of the way, let's talk about the 5 books I've chosen. First up is Header by Edward Lee. To me, this is actually the least disturbing of the books on this list, and that is saying something. It's extreme horror in all of its disgusting glory. On some level, we might call it more disgusting rather than disturbing, but there's a fine line between the two. So, what exactly is a header? Well, I'm not going to tell you, because part of the fun in reading this book is finding out what a header is. I will tell you that you probably don't want to know what a header is. Now, if you're the kind of person who's saying, well, now I need to know, then you're probably the kind of person who should read this book. On the other hand, if you're the kind of person thinking, maybe I don't really want to know, then this probably isn't the book for you. All of that said, it's also the shortest book on my list, only a few pages long. So if you're looking to dip a toe into the world of disturbing books, it might be a good way to go. It's not as disturbing as some of the others, and it's short enough that if you think it's just too much for you, you're not stuck reading 400 pages of it. The next book I've chosen isn't usually considered a horror novel, but though I think it's rather frightening, even more important than whether you call it horror or not is that it's one of the most disturbing books I've ever read, and that's We Need to Talk About Kevin by Lionel Shriver. This is the story of a mass murderer at a school shooting, and it's told from the perspective of his mother reflecting upon their relationship during Kevin's entire life as she tries to figure out what made him go so wrong, what made him do what he did, and whether maybe it's partly her own fault. It's not difficult to see why this book could be so disturbing. The very subject matter is disturbing. We've all read those news stories with horror, right? But it's also disturbing psychologically because it allows us to peek behind the curtain of what it might actually be like to be the parent of such a monster. When we read these news stories, we always look for who to blame. It's the guns, it's the pharmaceuticals, it's the schools, it's the parents, it's the video games, it's this, it's that, right? Well, you can imagine what it would be like to actually be one of the parents in the midst of all of this. Not only trying to make sense of the very same questions for yourself, but also magnified by your relationship with the perpetrator. But then also trying to navigate the social fallout and the media frenzy. To me, that's real horror. and it's portrayed in this book in such unflinching detail that it's really one of the most disturbing things I've ever read. But what really gets under my skin even more is the psychology portrayed in this book of both Kevin and his mother. And they seem exactly right. The book doesn't shy away from anything, but it's also handled with a softness of touch that allows the reader to move past knee-jerk reactions and to try to think about both what might cause these tragedies and how people respond to them. It's become one of my favorite books. It's as heartbreaking as it is disturbing. And the nice thing about it for many of you is that it's disturbing without being disgusting. So if you're turned off by extreme horror, this might be a good way for you to get that kind of visceral experience from a quieter sort of story. Next up is one that many of you already see coming, and that's The Girl Next Door by Jack Ketchum. Whenever somebody tries to discuss one of these lists of most disturbing books, this one is almost invariably included. And deservedly so. It's the kind of book that will haunt you for a very long time. But even though it's widely recommended, I still have to add my voice to the chorus because it's one of my favorites. I don't really want to say too much, because I think this is the sort of book you should read with as little foreknowledge as possible. What I will say is, even though it's a work of fiction, it's very closely based on a true story. And that true story has been called the most diabolical case ever to come before a court or jury. And that was by one of the prosecutors involved in the case. And it's considered by many to be the worst crime ever committed in the state of Indiana. One of the things that makes this crime, and the novel, so disturbing is it was committed against children. But even in that already disturbing class of crimes against children, this one really stands out. I'll admit it's definitely hard to get through the book, and that's a good thing. That makes it one of the most effective explorations of the dark side of humanity I've ever read. This is the kind of book that has a chapter of only a single sentence, and that sentence will send chills down your spine. Now, back in 2007, they actually made a movie out of this book, and I was gobsmacked that anyone would even try. Well, they did, and it's actually not bad. But if you've seen the movie and you haven't read the book, you really have no idea just how terrifying and disturbing this book really is. Stephen King called the movie the Dark Side of the Moon version of Stand By Me. And that seems like an apt description, but it fits the book even better than it does the movie. If you've got the stomach for it, read it. When people ask for disturbing books, I often use The Girl Next Door as a sort of litmus test, because it's one of the most disturbing books ever, certainly. But it doesn't go as far in some directions as some of the others do. Before I make a recommendation, sometimes I like to know what people thought of Ketchum's novel. If they couldn't stomach The Girl Next Door, there are certain books I simply won't recommend. Our next book is one of those, and that's Survivor by J.F. Gonzalez. I'll warn you right now, if The Girl Next Door was too much for you, Survivor is way too much for you. The basic story is relatively common in horror, especially in extreme horror. A woman is kidnapped, and they're going to rape and murder her on camera to make a snuff film. There are elements that complicate things and make it even more horrifying, but that's the basic premise. Where this book sets itself apart is that it doesn't just revel in the disgusting things the villains do to the main character, but it explores just how far down a deeply disturbing rabbit hole the victim herself might go in order to try to survive. Indeed, the novel ends up being much more about the survival instinct than about the crime itself. And what's disturbing is that it forces the reader to confront just how far any of us might be willing to go to preserve our own lives. And it does all of that without pulling any punches. Nothing is censored in this book. Nothing is left out. And if you thought the philosophical question at the novel's heart was disturbing, and it is, wait until you read some of the scenes in this thing. I've read a lot of really disgusting stuff in my day, and there's some stuff in this book that even makes me feel ill. I don't want to spoil much, because if you do decide to read it, you should be surprised by as much as possible. But let's just say that things happen in this book that you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy, and some of them happen to innocent people, including infant children. Seriously though, don't read Survivor until you've read The Girl Next Door. If you like that one, Survivor, though it's even a little bit more extreme, is probably for you. But if the Jack Ketchum book is too much for you, the Jesus Gonzalez book is definitely going to turn your stomach. Finally, we have Shackled by Ray Garton. This is another book that involves crimes against children, but while The Girl Next Door and Survivor are viscerally disturbing, Shackled is perhaps more intellectually disturbing. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty of visceral horror here too. But what disturbed me about this story was how close some of its elements come to things that I read about in the newspapers. This is a book about kidnapped and exploited children, to reduce it to a phrase. And as far as I know, it was one of the first books to explore how child sex rings could exploit internet technology to become even more terrifying than they were in the past. And yes, this book came out a few years ago, so some of the technological aspects of the book are almost comically outdated if you read it in 2020. But the main thrust of the story seems more timely than ever. I read somewhere that about 450,000 children are reported missing each year in the United States. And according to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, I'm quoting here, of the more than 23,500 endangered runaways reported to NCMEC in 2019, 1 in 6 were likely victims of child sex trafficking. Furthermore, the majority of these sex trafficking transactions appear to now take place online. This makes the world in which Shackled takes place seem even more disturbing and entirely too close to our own world for comfort. Well, that does it. Those are 5 of the most disturbing books ever written. If you're looking for something that can really get under your skin, try one of these. In the meantime, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with your own disturbing book recommendations down below. And until next time, take care and stay scared.